The better you know your enemy, the more equipped you are to overcome him. Today we're going to learn 5 things about temptation from Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Let's go ahead and read it. It says, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." So the first thing we learn here about temptation is that there are no special temptations. It says all temptation is common to man, meaning there's no temptation that you will face that someone else hasn't already faced. There is no severity of temptation that you will face that someone else hasn't already faced. And that's important because we need to realize that there are no special cases. We are not a special case. Our temptation isn't a special case. Sometimes we might think because my temptation is so unique and different, my temptation is so challenging and difficult, then that gives me an excuse to fail. Whereas normally I wouldn't do such and such a thing. This situation's so difficult, so severe that I have a little bit of an excuse. I'm a little bit justified in giving into temptation because after all, it's a special case. But here it's clear, there are no special cases. And any temptation that you face is something that someone else already has. And just as God has expected that person to overcome temptation, God right now is expecting you to overcome that temptation as well. The second thing we learn about temptation is that God is faithful to us while we are being tempted. And this is important for us to understand. First of all, it's important for us to realize that temptation is not the same thing as sin. Jesus Christ himself was tempted and yet was without sin. So the mere fact that I'm tempted to do something sinful does not mean I'm already living in sin. And so if I'm tempted to commit sin, I need to realize that God is still right there with me, faithful to me, trying to help me to overcome that temptation. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was tempted. Think about Jesus in the wilderness. He was tempted to not follow through with God's plan. But God was there with him, and God helped him to overcome those temptations. If we feel that we are already in sin just because we're tempted, we're going to feel like a failure, and we're going to say, well, then what's the point for me continuing to fight against this temptation if I'm already sinning, if I'm already making God mad? And we lose a lot of motivation. But we shouldn't see it that way. If we are being tempted, we need to realize that we have entered into the battle, and that is a time more than ever that we need to realize God is there with us, and God really wants us to deny that temptation and to do what's right. Third thing we learn about temptation is that God allows us to be tempted. Now, James chapter 1, verse 13 tells us that God does not tempt us. God is not using temptation against us because he wants us to sin, because he wants to punish us. In fact, it says God is the giver of every good gift. It's quite the opposite. God is doing good things for us, almost as if he were tempting us to do good rather than evil. So God is not tempting us, but God does allow us to be tempted. It's clear that God has allowed Satan to have some degree of power in this world. He's running around causing all kinds of problems and tempting people in whatever way it is that he does that. And so what's important for us to understand is that we will be tempted. Sometimes we think that we can achieve a degree of righteousness to the point that we will no longer be tempted. Well, I'm fighting with this temptation now, but eventually I'm going to become so holy that this will not tempt me anymore. And it's true that there are some temptations that we can completely outgrow until they no longer affect us. But there are plenty of other temptations that we will continue to fight for the rest of our life. Or even if I do outgrow one particular temptation and that no longer affects me, a new temptation will be there right behind it, tempting me in a different way. And what's important for us to understand is we will always be tempted. So we need to always be prepared to face temptation. Don't think that you're going to become so holy that it no longer requires any kind of effort on your part to overcome temptation. We will always need to be ready to fight. The fourth thing we learn about temptation is that God does not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able. And that means theoretically we can say no to and overcome any and every temptation that we face. That means we never have to sin. Now I understand that we do sin. Now, I understand that Romans 3 tells us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But I would suggest to you that this passage is telling us that there is no sin that we had to commit. There are only sins that we chose to commit. So whenever temptation comes my way, you need to understand I don't have to do this. And sometimes it feels so intense, the temptations we go through, that we feel like we have no choice, that we have to sin because we just can't overcome it. This passage says no. There is no temptation that you aren't able to overcome. we can theoretically live for the rest of our lives with no sin. And if we accept the fact that we could overcome every single temptation, we would probably try a lot harder to overcome them rather than just admitting defeat before we ever even put forth the effort to say no. And the fifth and final thing that we learn about temptation in this verse is that God provides us a way of escape from temptation. This is the way in which we can overcome every temptation, because God always gives us a way out. The reason we commit sin is because we're going down this highway towards sin, and there are all these exit ramps telling us to get out here and get out there. We can flee from temptation. We can tell the truth. We can abandon ship and stop going down this path towards sin. But why do we keep going towards sin? It's ultimately because we want to. Again, not because we have to. God's provided us ways to turn around and to escape from this temptation, but we haven't taken those paths because we ultimately want to end up in this sin. We want to commit this sin, and we pretend and act like we're trying to fight it the whole way through, but ultimately we don't really want to fight that hard because we want to end up committing that sin. We need to realize God's always providing us a way of escape. We can always say no and find a way out of temptation. All right, so in conclusion, we ultimately just need to realize that we can win the battle through God's strength. We can say no to temptation and live good and holy lives. All right, thank you guys.